One person, one vote. One person, one vote. One of the simplest ideas of democracy. It's supposed to ensure that in general, over time, overall, the government will do stuff that most people want. That the government will enact policies that most people who elect that government will want them to enact. So what do you do if you want government to do stuff that most people really hate? If you want government to do things for which you've got maybe minority support, but which, say, are going to awaken the vast populist sleeping dragon that is the middle class, that is people who work for a living, the traditional base of the Democratic Party, all rising up against you. One thing that might help you get away with passing policies like that is to have a ton of money on your side. Having a few freely spending billionaires on your side can really help limit the damage your policies might cost you at the polls. But you know what would really help? Just directly limiting the damage your unpopular policies are going to cost you at the polls. Limiting it at the polls. Keeping likely Democratic voters out of elections. You know who's a likely Democratic voter? A poor voter, a low-income voter. You know what might make fewer low-income people vote? If you don't allow people to register or to vote unless they show a kind of ID that poor people are less likely to have. You know who else is a likely Democratic voter? Minority voters. You know what might make fewer of them vote? If you force people to show a kind of ID that minorities are less likely to have. You know who else is a likely Democratic voter? College students. You see how this goes. Say that you can't vote or you can't register unless you show ID that college students are less likely to have, and you can thereby reduce the number of college students who are voting. First-time voters are another constituency that's more likely to vote Democratic. If you want to make sure that fewer of them vote, get rid of the ability to register and vote on the same day. First-time voters love that. So stop doing that. Here's another example. The state of Florida made a civil rights advance in the year 2007. Moderate Republican Governor Charlie Crist said if you were convicted of a felony after you completed your sentence and paid your debt to society, you could have your voting rights restored. More than 150,000 Floridians did so. And for a state struggling with the reintegration of former prisoners back into society, the challenge of knitting people cast out from society back into society, those 150,000 civil rights success stories were kind of inspiring. And those new voters were considered demographically to be likely to cast their votes for Democrats. And so Florida's new Republican government this week rescinded that civil right, effective immediately. Governor Rick Scott and his cabinet voted yesterday that you now have to wait 5 years before you can even ask to have your rights restored. That ought to take care of it. While Wisconsin's famous Senate Democrats were in out-of-state exile to try to stop the Republicans' union stripping bill there, one of the things Republicans did in their absence was bring the state within about an inch of passing a law that would make it more difficult to vote in Wisconsin than probably in any other state in the nation. Among the provisions of the Wisconsin Republicans' Make It Hard to Vote bill would be that your Wisconsin student ID will no longer be sufficient ID for you to be allowed to vote. See, that's very handy because students tend to vote lopsidedly for Democrats. When Democratic presidential candidate John Kerry ran in 2004, he won the state of Wisconsin barely. He won by 11,000 votes total in the whole state. At the University of Wisconsin at Madison, at just that one university, there are 17,000 out-of-state students who, it's safe to say, if they voted, mostly voted Democratic. They voted mostly Democratic then. They would most likely vote Democratic again, as young people and college students tend to do. So Wisconsin Republicans are throwing up a huge procedural hurdle to make it harder for students to vote. The U.S. Supreme Court has affirmed that if you are living somewhere to attend college there, you can vote there. But that doesn't mean Republicans have to make it easy. So no student IDs. In New Hampshire, Republicans are trying the same deal.
The kids coming out of school and basically doing what I did when I was a kid and foolish, voting as a liberal. You know, and that's what kids do. They don't have life experience, and they just vote their feelings.
Stupid kids. That New Hampshire Republican legislator there has introduced legislation that would only let college students vote in their college towns if they or their parents had previously established permanent residency there. Another New Hampshire bill would end Election Day registration, which would disproportionately impact first-time voters and young voters who, again, are more likely to vote Democratic. Over in Texas, they're dealing with a massive $27 billion budget deficit. In order to deal with that state's disastrous budget emergency, Republican Governor Rick Perry has introduced 5 bills this session that he insists must be considered on an emergency basis. One of them, just so you know, would make the state spend millions of dollars a year to force women to have ultrasounds if they wanted to be allowed by his grace, Rick Perry, to get an abortion. Apparently that's an emergency. Also, government small enough to fit in your uterus in Texas. But also on Rick Perry's emergency list is a restrictive new voter ID law for Texas, which, just like all of these, is expected to make it a lot harder for young people, first-time voters, poor voters, minority voters, and other traditional Democratic constituencies to get registered to vote and to actually cast their vote. This is the best part of it. The great partisan tell in the Texas law is that Republicans did recognize this is going to cause sort of a hardship. It's going to make it a little bit hard for some people to register and for people to vote. So they did include two exemptions to this draconian new voter ID law. Two exemptions. The two exemptions are for the elderly and for people who have concealed carry gun permits. So the only people they have exempted from their new make it harder to vote voter ID bill are the most reliably Republican constituencies in the country other than the Cheney family: gun owners and the very old. In the 2008 presidential election, among Texas voters 65 and older, the Republican John McCain beat Barack Obama by 34 points. Among gun owners in the entire country, 62% voted for John McCain. These are the two groups for whom voting will be easiest now in the great state of Texas. But for everybody else, it gets harder. You know what this is not about? This is not about the budget. It's also not about voter fraud, because this is the face of voter fraud. This is the face of voter fraud in this country right now, this pitiful specimen. This is Indiana's Secretary of State, the top election official in Indiana. His name is Charlie White. He's a Republican, although that doesn't really matter. He has been charged with the pitiful voter fraud crime of lying about still living at his ex-wife's house so he could keep his job on the city council there. And then he voted in her precinct as well because he wanted to keep up the illusion that he still lived there, even though he had moved somewhere else. It is pitiful. It would be pitiful even if he was not the Secretary of State. But it's particularly pitiful given that. And that guy's case, that's sort of what voter fraud looks like in this country. There are a handful of sad sacks every year who register at the wrong address, or who forget that they are already registered and fill out a second registration form, or who don't know that because they are on probation, they're not supposed to vote. Those are the kinds of things that constitute the voter fraud supposed epidemic in this country that you hear about on the Fox News channel. Is there a voter fraud epidemic in the United States of America of people using fake IDs in order to impersonate somebody else while voting? No, there is not. But for a long time now, the right has been stoking hysteria about it. Fox News even set up a special email hotline before the last election so you, average American, could report what was undoubtedly rampant voter fraud to Fox News. It was announced on Megyn Kelly's show. The right promotes hysteria about mass voter fraud. It's familiar, right? In order to create a sense that there is a crisis, in order to justify public policy that makes it harder to register and harder to vote. Policies that specifically target voters likely to vote Democratic, to make it harder for those voters specifically to participate in an election. It is supposedly public policy that puts a Republican thumb on the scale for the next election and for every election after, making it more cumbersome and difficult to vote, particularly if you are a likely Democratic voter. They overreached on this big time during the Bush administration. Remember, this is where the whole U.S. attorney scandal came from. Karl Rove giving speeches around the country about the menace of voter fraud, and then the White House political operation pressuring federal prosecutors to bring charges, to find cases, to make it seem like there was a voter fraud crisis because the states needed to crack down on that voter fraud and incidentally make it harder for likely Democratic voters to register and to cast their votes. But U.S. attorney scandal or not, get this. Right now, in 2011, Republicans in 32 states are considering adding more onerous ID requirements to make it harder to register and harder to vote, which should bring down the number of Democratic voters nicely in time for the 2012 presidential election, and which should limit any electoral damage these guys might be expecting from pushing for even wildly unpopular redistribution of resources and rights away from America's middle class. Ta-da!